Hi there. It's so nice to have all of you join us today. I'm very thrilled to have our guest. And from our last and our first webinar, This, Not That, we had a lot of wonderful survey feedback and responses that people asked for practitioners. And they really wanted to hear what you do in the classroom, particularly what you do in the classroom if your school is not yet a science of reading school and your school hasn't yet adopted curriculum that is helping you have impact with your students. And so there were many questions on that front, as well as from teachers and educators who are in school districts or charter networks and schools that have adopted new curriculum, and they're trying to get implementation support and trying to find ways to really improve their practice and shift their practice. So I am really excited to have two extraordinary experts with us today. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about them as well. Laurie, do you mind starting?
Sure. And thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak to the community today. I'm Laurie Maloney. I'm an academic language therapist. I've been working one-on-one with students with specific learning disabilities, dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD for over 2 decades now. I also served as president of the DC Capital Area branch of the International Dyslexia Association and finished up a 6-year term in 2020 21, I forget. But anyway, I also co-founded Decoding Dyslexia DC, and we're proud that our legislation was passed and is being implemented right now. And I have some other things going on, which I'll tell you about on another call sometime. But mainly, I work with children one-on-one to teach them to read, to spell, to handwrite, and to improve their academics generally.
And Gina?
Awesome. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So, I am a first grade teacher in a gen ed classroom, but I am also Orton Gillingham trained through the Academy and MZ letters trained as well. I was motivated to start this journey when my daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia herself. So, I was a balanced literacy trained teacher, I had a balanced literacy classroom, and as once her diagnosis happened, I just thought this could not be it. This could not be the way. So I started researching, started educating myself. So I am still in the classroom and I also tutor out of my home one on one Orton Gillingham.
So I want to invite our
Mm.
audience to feel free to put questions directly in the chat and we'll feed those right in. But I'm going to
Mm.
start asking Gina. So you already shared that your
Uh-huh.
own daughter was
Mm.
was diagnosed with dyslexia and that caused you to wonder what you were doing with balanced literacy and then to begin a shift. But tell
Yeah.
us a little bit more about when you first thought, okay, I want to make a shift. What did you do? How did you go about it? And you were in a balanced literacy school. So what did that look like for you?
It was like a rabbit hole. It all came at me like a fire hose of information once I opened the door of I don't know, I can't remember the exact first whether it was a post or blog that mentioned science of reading and how the brain learns to read. And the first thing that got me was we weren't wired to read, we were wired to speak. And I started Googling every term, every phrase, everything I could find to get more and more and more. Luckily, I was actually telling Lori before we started, luckily I'm in a school that was open. It was transitioning from balanced literacy. The district I was in before her diagnosis was very balanced literacy. The district that I was in once we got the diagnosis was more, do what you gotta do for your kids, do what's right, and we are actually shifting majorly to structured literacy now in my district, so it's very, very exciting.
I'll just ask you a quick follow-up on
Yeah.
that. Tell us when you dove into this rabbit hole and started
Mhm.
digging, how did you yourself begin to start learning how to shift your practice?
I well, I read, Shifting the Balance. I think that's a great book for anybody who is shifting from balance. It's a great way to put in little things. I would bring in decodable readers into my small groups. I started mapping words. I started using, instead of having the kids just repeat their spelling words over and over and over again, because we are still required to have spelling lists, and there's certain things that we still have to do. Um, I started having them map using Elkalon boxes. We were using more multi-sensory techniques. I brought in sand trays. Anything that I was learning that was connecting more channels in the brain to bring into my small group in my classroom. And also some things were pushed to the side. Like, I know it's more important right now that we are learning the code and how to decode. And I was able to also pinpoint better as I started to learn, like, okay, this child does have something going on. This child needs a little bit more of this. I was able to not prescribe better what I was giving to my students, instead of just, this is what I know, here is this box, here are the way I'm going to teach every single child. Knowing now with structured literacy, we can be a little bit more prescriptive to each one and what their needs are.
The reason why we named this whole webinar series "This Not That" is
Mhm.
we wanted people to understand that while this is incredibly complex work and you really have to know it well, at the same time, you can start doing a little of this, not that,
Yes,
and begin to make shifts, right? And so just
absolutely.
shifting Fontes and Pinnell out of a classroom and leveled reader and start using Decodable, it's not going to be obviously the entire comprehensive body of work you need to do, but there are things you can start doing to move toward it as you're getting up to speed. But Laurie, I'm going to turn it over to you. I almost don't even know what question to ask you because you have
Mhm.
so much knowledge and all these decades of experience. But,
Mhm.
I think maybe start with practitioners who are out here listening, principals,
Mhm.
teachers, heads of school, district leaders. What would you say to them on their shifting? They've just adopted
Mhm.
a science of reading curriculum, and now they have many, many teachers who were trained in teacher prep programs that didn't teach them how to teach kids to read. Where do they
Yeah.
start? What are some of the
Yeah.
most important things they have to understand?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to understand is that, as Louisa Moat says, reading is rocket science. It truly is. The language is very complex, and yet we can learn to become expert teachers of reading. We just have to avail ourselves of the body of knowledge that is required to do a good job. So, um, I think that it's important to understand that there's two types of training involved. Actually, three. The first is that a good teacher of reading should have a very robust knowledge of the structure of the English language. And it's elegant enough and organized enough to be able to learn it and really appreciate its complexity without being intimidated by it. Because the less you know, the more intimidating it is. Um, so that's really important, a good understanding of the structure of English. The second is that there's a difference between training in the structure of the language and delivering reading instruction in the classroom. And so a lot of uh, administrators make the assumption that if we just buy this curriculum and hand it to the teachers and give them some basic training on delivery, that they will have the knowledge that they need in order to teach reading. And I liken that to a family practice doctor asking to do a kidney transplant and pulling a binder off the shelf because it's
Oh.
kind of like
Mhm,
that.
mhm.
We want our surgeons to be well trained in all of the systems and then use the protocol that's appropriate for that procedure. Um, so we have to know the language. We have to know how to teach it, which is a separate training. And then we have to know a good bit about why children struggle to learn to read. So that involves an understanding of dyslexia, um, dysgraphia, the impacts of attention deficit, things like that. Also, the specific needs of children who speak a foreign language at home and are learning English for the first time, or who speak a dense community dialect and have to kind of map their oral language onto printed language. That can be challenging. So there's a lot to know just about what readers bring to the classroom, and be able to respond appropriately. Um, I said 4 things. I don't know, those are the 3 main. So we've got the language, we've got how to deliver good instruction, and when we have all of that, we become expert consumers of curriculum. So you
Mm.
have to know all of that stuff in order to open up a curriculum, look at the scope and sequence, and see that there may be gaps, there may be illogical aspects to the scope and sequence. It may not be granular enough. But then that's not going to matter, because as a practitioner, a teacher, you'll be able to bring your knowledge to the delivery of that curriculum and meet the needs of the children in the classroom. So those are the, the 4 major issues. And then there is one kind of major other thing that teachers need to know, and this is my own personal viewpoint, and that is that we focus a lot on decoding, right? That's the new thing. We really want kids to decode, so we have to bring phonics knowledge, phonics instruction and phonemic awareness instruction into the classroom. And I would maintain that we should focus on teaching children to be expert spellers as our top priority. Because if children can spell, they can read. And if you teach the letters as having a component sound, and you teach all the letters, that's 26 letters, 45 speech sounds, 100 ways to spell those sounds, and you link the sound with the letter production, you're creating good spellers. So spelling, which is sometimes kind of over here in the lesson plan, separate from phonics, they should be like this. They should be so interwoven that that decoding progress occurs at the same pace as spelling progress.
I'm going to jump into the spelling for a minute because I think I want to make sure our audience understands what you're saying about spelling. I
Okay.
think at least the way I learned to spell is each week I was given 10 words. I had to memorize them, know the definition, and come back and pass my spelling test. Just last year, my son in 4th grade had the same experience. He was being given a list, he had to memorize the words, and he learned how to spell them. It was really fascinating to watch how he just wrote, memorized, and then he would spit them back out on the test. He'd make a good grade. And the following week, if I asked him to spell them, there'd be no recollection.
Done.
I am pretty sure that is not what you're talking about. So,
Right.
Lori and Gina, jump in and tell us what you're talking about.
Okay. Gina, do you want to go
Yeah.
ahead?
I
Gina, you
I
jump
can.
in and then we'll have Lori add more.
Well, Lori's talking. I'm like, yes, yes, everything she's
Mhm.
saying. Well, because honestly, that is where we are at in our district transition is we have to give these words and we have to give the test. I've actually had people when I've posted about that on my Instagram account come at me and say, then you can't call yourself a structured literacy teacher if you're doing that, if you're giving these words. And I understand that it's not right, but we're transitioning. We have to give some grace because we don't know what we don't know, and teachers are required to do it. But absolutely, those lists, when my kids come that I tutor, I'll spend 5 or 10 minutes on those lists that they have to do, and they'll get it. But then when I ask them to read it in a sentence, they can't. What I think is one of the greatest assessments I use for my students in my classroom in here is I ask them to do like a word inquiry of the skills that I think they should know. And if they can spell it, then I know what needs to be reviewed, what they got, or where I need to pick up from on the scope and sequence that I'm using. So it's just making sure they can use it in a sentence. And if they, like they said, if they can spell it, then I know they got it.
Lori, add more onto this spelling concept. And when you say the
Okay.
weaving, tell us
So
what you mean by that
I
weaving.
teach spelling. Okay. Um, so I teach spelling at the letter level first. So students have to be able to associate a sound with a written shape. So as they're learning the motor movements for a letter shape that they're writing, they say that sound. So they're marrying those two facts about, um, and I care about the quality of the written letter. So we'll work on precision also. Um, eventually, eventually I'll teach students to blend sounds, you know, as they write. So for example, if they're writing the word cat, they would spell sound by sound. They wouldn't name the letters as they spell, they would spell sound by sound. So I have to build in that process of syllable by syllable, sound by sound spelling. They have to do that. They have to sub-vocalize or whisper the speech sounds to them, to themselves, as they spell. And they have to do that for a long time until the process becomes automatic up here internally. Um, that's really important because eventually there are going to be multiple ways to spell a given sound. And what determines which way you spell a sound often is determined by the type of syllable. So there's 6 types of syllables in the English language. And I like teaching them explicitly because within syllable types, you have the very logic of the English language as far as I'm concerned. So you have to teach syllable type. And when students are spelling, they will think about what type of syllable they're telling themselves to spell, and then they'll know, oh, this is an open syllable, or this is a closed syllable, or this is an R-controlled syllable. So it sounds like short O, but it's actually A, that kind of thing. They have to become really as educated about the structure of English as their teacher. So when I was saying earlier that expert spelling is the number one priority, this is what I'm talking about. Because if they can spell well, they really truly understand the language and the patterns of the language. So spelling starts out with spelling sounds through a daily review. They see a letter, they have to name the letter, uh, say the sound that it represents while writing it. And they do that regularly, cumulatively, over time, practice, 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 until everything's automatic. They have all the properties of that letter. And then they go on and they learn all of the what we call regular aspects of the language, the predictable, rule-based, aspects of the language. Because then they quickly get into all the irregular aspects of the language, the vowel digraphs, the unusual spellings for sounds. The long sound of A can be spelled 12 ways in English. My students need to learn all of those ways in order to be good spellers. And when you're a good speller, you're a good reader. So spelling is one of the hardest things that we ask children to do. Spelling requires so many neurofunctions, so many sub skills, a lot of executive function, a lot of visual spatial planning and all. It's extremely complex. But if we teach it in a very systematic way, and students have ample practice on a daily basis, that we move at the pace of, that's reasonable, that we ensure that children achieve mastery before moving on, then they will become good
Mhm.
spellers and in doing so, good readers.
Gina, did you want to add to that? You are shaking your head. If not, I have
No, because
another
it's
question.
no, it's wonderful, and it's so true. I wish a lot, and I think part of it is when you were talking about teachers being educated on the structure of our language, that's one of the thing walking the halls in my building, a lot of teachers don't know it, and because we're not taught that. So
Right,
it the students need to know it just as much as the students, and I think
right.
it's making a world of difference focusing on that while you're teaching that spelling is just as important.
Mhm.
I'm going to roll back to
Mhm.
some more basic concepts for just a minute because I think we have members in our community and audience right now that are all over in terms of where they are in their journeys of being part of this science of reading, understanding, and movement. So, structured explicit literacy. It's a term we keep hearing tossed about. Gina, what does that actually mean?
When people ask me that, I usually go back to that is like an umbrella term of literacy that encompasses Orton Gillingham falls under that. So the principles of multisensory, systematic, explicit, prescriptive literacy. So that the way it was explained, and that was coined, was it coined by the IDA? Structured literacy. There was some history there. Yes. Okay, I am right with that.
Yeah.
So it's the opposite of balanced literacy. Balanced literacy kind of goes from the top down, like you start at learning the whole word, and then eventually, if you don't get it, then they go down this way to the phoneme level. Whereas structured literacy, we start from the bottom up and start with just the very simplest of sounds and everything and work our way up. Plus, we bring in all the strands of including comprehension and oral language and vocabulary and fluency and all that. It's more taken in to structured literacy, where balanced literacy is more the guessing strategies of looking at the picture and the three cueing system and stuff like that.
Or do you want to add anything more?
I mean, that would be my response, just that, it incorporates all of the, required elements as put forth by the, um, National Reading Panel, that it focuses on phonics and phonemic awareness and vocabulary fluency comprehension. Comprehension is kind of an outgrowth of those other things. Um, I would also include morphology, which doesn't get talked about
Mhm.
enough, but morphology is the study of meaningful parts of words. And actually, morphological awareness helps with comprehension as well as spelling, because when you know how to spell prefixes, roots, and suffixes as sort of units, then your spelling improves as well. So um, I
We
would
have a
include.
question that I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to go
Mhm.
back in a second to, well, actually, let me ask one question, then we're going to go to the question that just got posted. Can you explain the difference in phonemic awareness and phonics? Laurie, you want to take a stab?
Yeah.
Sure. Phonemic awareness is the ability to attend to the individual sounds in syllables and words, to delete a sound from a syllable, to add a sound, or to shift that sound in some way. So, for example, if I said to you, say the word ghost, you would say ghost. I would say, now say it again, but don't say s. And you would have to come up with
Got
goat. It's
goat,
hard.
goat, goat, goat.
Goat,
It is.
right?
I know that. Yeah, goat.
So it's hard. It starts out very basic, like say the word
Mhm.
sunshine. Now say it again, but don't say sun, all the way
Shine.
to
Mm.
drop the S from ghost. So it's that ability, it's like mental math. It's the ability to
Mm.
manipulate, delete, add on whatever speech sounds in the absence of print. And there is this idea that if children have good phonemic awareness, they will have an easier time learning to crack the code and learning to spell. Um, Phonics is the deliberate pairing of speech sounds with their letter counterpart. That's phonics. It's the pairing of sounds, the mapping of sounds onto printed letters.
And I
And
often hear people say
they really
phonics. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So
Go ahead.
it's rule-based. English is
That's
an alphabetic
exactly what I was going to
language.
ask you.
Yeah, English is an alphabetic language with a code. And so when we teach it as a code, rather than like Mandarin, where words have, a pronunciation, teach it as a code. Um, I'm sorry, where characters have meaning, our symbols have sounds. So when we teach it as a code, and we teach it in a very structured, very explicit way, where we teach all the properties of a letter, then the students are then able to combine letters to form words and then to blend those sounds. So that's
We have
phonics.
a question about the best way to have students practice spelling. After breaking into syllables, is there something that's most effective to help them learn? Writing, magnet letters, verbal, what else?
I would say start spelling individual sounds. So, so here's how I teach spelling. Once I teach a letter through a multisensory linkage procedure, I teach, I dictate words that have that letter, that target letter, plus letters that I've taught previously. And I don't dictate words that have letters or patterns or syllable types that I've not yet taught. So I'm always guaranteeing that my student can be successful. Um, um, so first I have students spell a word sound by sound. Then I have the students spell, but first they have to count out the sounds. Then I have the student, and that student is saying those sounds as they spell. And then they code and read. So they're always marking the short vowel with a breve, they're dividing syllables, things like that. And then I dictate and they spell the word sound by sound. Then I dictate maybe some phrase. We do that regularly. And then as they learn new letters, then they're able to spell more words. I would never recommend giving spelling lists to young students because they would then try to memorize the spelling as as though the word were an object itself, which is sort of like balanced literacy, you know, memorizing the
Mhm.
shape of words. I would rather see children learn a process for spelling any word, a process, a procedure. Listen, you know, say the word, repeat the word, listen for the sounds that you hear in that word, count them out, tap the desk, fold your fingers back, whatever it is, do this, hear those sounds, and then
Mhm.
say each sound as that word is spelled. The student won't
Th-
have to do it forever, you know?
Right. Yeah.
I'm going to give you, so S, take us through it. So you are teaching your student to spell with S. They're being introduced S. Walk us through what that explanation was that you gave with an actual example here.
Okay, so I would say to the student, I'm going to say some words. You listen, echo these words, and listen for the sound that you hear at the beginning of each word. This is classic Orton Gillingham. I mean, this goes back 100 years. So I would say sock, silly, sun, swim. You know, I would give 4 words. The student would have to hear that word in initial position. Um, and the student would say, "S." And then I'd have the student reach into a bag and I'd say, okay. Um, um, First, I'd show a phonogram card and I'd say, you know, what letter do you think represents this sound? And the student might say S. So I would show a card with the letter S on it. Then I'd have the child reach into a bag and try to guess that there was a sock inside that bag. And the child would pull out the sock. We would talk about the sock. I'd show a keyword card with the letter S and a picture of a sock. So now that word, that key word becomes a kind of an anchor for that sound. Child can always go back to sock to pull the sound off the beginning of that word. And then we're going to repeat S, sock, S every day for the duration of the intervention until that child knows that sound and can spell that sound perfectly. Um, so then I would add that letter to, well, first I would take the child through a multisensory linkage procedure where they're skywriting, desk writing, saying the sounds, writing the letter with eyes closed. I teach cursive exclusively, but you don't have to. Um, and then we go on to reading words that have that letter. Um, added to other letters that the child has been taught up to that point, and then there's a procedure for reading those words. So name the letters from left to right. S-A-D. Blend through the vowel. Sa. Now blend through and finish. Sad. Go on. S-A-T. Sa. Sat. Code the vowel with the breathe. That kind of thing. If I can talk for a minute about blending through the vowel, or Gina, do you want to add before I talk about
No, go
that?
ahead. I'm
Okay.
loving listening to you. No, that's great.
Okay. All right. So there are a number of ways that teachers ask children to read words. The first common way is just to memorize the word through repeated reading, as though that would be an adequate way to learn all words, and it's not. It's fine for those little CVC words usually. So when teaching, what I was saying is there's a couple ways. Just memorize the word as a whole word. Um, Sound out. So s-at. For many students, it's hard to go from s-at to sat. Or, and this is most common, they'll say s-at, s-at. This is really hard for some kids because what it does is it trains them to look at the back end of a word and come to the front and kind of go to the back. It's common to do because you can teach word families like bat, cat, sat, fat, rat, mat, and so forth. And so kids get in the habit of looking at the rhyme, the R-I-M-E rhyme, and then expecting that they'll just recognize it as a unit. Well, that doesn't work when you get to longer and more complex words. So what I teach students is to blend through the vowel in every syllable. So sat, sat is phi. So they learn this procedure for blending that is demonstrably different from sounding out or whole word memorization. It's a lifeline for these kids for when they get to 4 and 5 and 6 syllable words. And you've taught them syllable type and syllable division. That's how they're trained to attack words. So blending through the vowel, if you take nothing else away from what I say today, this is the most important thing. Blend through the vowel. It's a game changer.
I'm gonna show them an example of what it looks like. So, and then I'll tell you more about this in a minute, but this is an example of what whoops. So you would spell it out. Lori, I'll let you take us through this card.
Okay, so S-L-A-P, slap.
And so for so many kids, not only are they learning the family of at or it or ip, and then that makes it more difficult often for them to blend or come to a word, as Lori's saying, like satisfy. But a lot of schools are still also teaching blending where it's each letter sound and then you speed it up to try to pull it together. And I've heard kids, if this one, for example, slap, it would be sa, la, a, pa. And then the teacher says, go faster. And what you often hear kids do is sa, la, a, pa, sa, la, a, pa. And it's not helping them blend it.
Right.
And so this process of where you are saying the letter name, so you're continuing to learn that spelling and the letter name, and then you're practicing the letter sound. So it is again, sla, pause, and then blend through the vowel and finish. So you're blending through the vowel and stopping, and then you're blending through the vowel and finishing. So that is a really, really helpful tip. And I've talked to lots of teachers with that tip, and they love it. And they say it is really game changing in their classroom. And particularly when they're working with a reader that's struggling, to help them speed up or accelerate their blending. So that's a great tip. We have another question. Oh, what is the advantage of teaching cursive exclusively? Wouldn't that make it more difficult for the students to later read print language?
Could you repeat the question,
Oh,
Jacqueline? I'm
sure,
sorry.
sure.
Yeah.
What is the advantage of teaching cursive exclusively, and wouldn't that make it more difficult for a student to read printed language?
Um, I'll address the second part of the question first. When I teach cursive, I have students map the cursive letter over the printed letter. And when I'm teaching them cursive, they are looking at a printed form of the letter, but they're skywriting in cursive. So the benefit of cursive is that there are no two letters that have the same shape, unlike with print with the BDPQ. That's one benefit. Also, there's space between words. And so um, students learn to write their letter in cursive, leave a space, and then write the next letter. It helps them to go kind of sound by sound. There's a, you know, the word cursive comes from like current, like the flow of a river. So it flows. And also, interesting things happen in the brain that you can read about if you follow the research of Virginia Berninger and others who have looked at that. Now, what the latest research tells us is that there's that really it's totally fine for kids to learn print or cursive as long as they stick with the the method that they learned first. Say in kindergarten or first grade they learned print, stay with that for a couple of years before you introduce the other. um, so if you start with cursive, stay with cursive for 2 years and then introduce print. um, the people who have the most fluent handwriting by the time they are adults are those who have a hybrid of cursive and print.
Hmm.
So it's the neatest, most legible, and the fastest. It's a hybrid. So it really doesn't matter. Just stick with one or the other. But I like to teach cursive even after a child's been writing in print for 3 or 4 or 7 years because we're starting fresh. And for me, cursive is a language delivery system so that I can change the wiring in the brain for reading and spelling. So it's just something new. And they end up being able to do both. It doesn't hurt them to have two styles.
Gina, let's
Mhm.
go back to phonemic awareness for a minute because
Okay.
I know for a while there was so much focus on phonics that there was not enough focus on this piece around phonemic awareness.
Mhm.
What does that look like for you in a classroom? What are you doing to help build children's understanding of sounds?
That's awesome question because I've just read or listened to an article about some new research that came out. So we were using Heggerty. We are using Heggerty. So kind of how it goes from the simplest of segmenting, blending, isolating sounds, separating syllables, and then as it goes through the year, then we are manipulating more sounds and doing things like that. And we're taking about 15 minutes a day doing Heggerty. Now that we're transitioning to piloting some phonics curriculums, they have more of a little chunk, maybe like 3 minutes a day of just more simple, just blending, segmenting, some isolation or manipulation, but not as much as Heggerty going through everything for every child all the time. So now I'm kind of focusing more on what the students need because from what I'm reading, if they have it, they have it. Why do we keep pounding it? If a student is good at manipulating or segmenting, like we don't need to keep going from what I'm understanding. So I'm doing what the students need, but I do a lot in my small group. So let's say we're working on the TH digraph. I'll do some word chains. I really like to do word chains with them, whether we do it without the letters or with the letters, just to if we change the vowel sound or changing the position. So we're changing one sound in a word at a time. I guess TH wasn't really a great example, but if we're just doing short vowels, like so we start with cat, um, and manipulating the short A, change cat to cot, things like that. But we'll stick to the phonics scale and do it in small group with or without letters.
Mhm,
Great. Um,
mhm.
Tips of the trade. I mean, I know this is incredibly complex and it's hard to give some tips, but Laura, you said, if there's one thing you leave this with, it's to blend through the vowel, pause, and blend through the vowel and finish.
Mhm.
Give us some more tips like that. I'm going to ask both of you just to give some things that are really um, game changing for people's practice and can be small first steps.
Yeah. Um, the first, I think, is that we need to check our speech sounds. So if you're a teacher and you're teaching, you may want to just make sure that your sounds are pure. And if you go to the internet and you type in the 44 speech sounds of English, um, you'll come up with you'll hit um, a website where a woman runs through all 44 sounds and says them perfectly. Um, and I'll try to get that link to you, Jacqueline, and you can pass it on. But having pure sounds as a teacher is really, really important. And I know that some don't because my students come to me with sounds that are not helpful in the process. So number one, everybody, let's clean up our speech sounds. Um, I
And Laurie, I'm
mentioned
going to just give a quick example because I was
yeah,
one of the worst at doing this. It's duh rather than duh.
right.
I'm going to ask you to pronounce the D, but I would always say duh with our son, and that's adding that whole UH.
Mhm.
And then when he's trying to blend, it's going to make it more difficult because he's got a few extra letters of sound in there. So, Laura, you
Right.
say the D, and I'm going to have you keep going, but I wanted to give a very concrete
Mhm.
example.
So it's a very short, crisp sound. It's d, d. It has no vowel sound like schwa sound attached to it. But I once assessed a student. I gave her a list of sounds to spell, and she wrote DU, CU, LU, RU, all the way down. Ra, sa. I mean, it blew my mind, but of course it really didn't blow my mind. But it's just pretty wild. So anyway, let's all make sure we have pure speech sounds and teach them and make sure that our students have good letter sounds as well. Um, tips.
Gina can jump in with a tip. We'll go
Yeah,
back and forth.
Gina
I'm Lori. I have a student coming in 15 minutes. I cannot wait to try to blend through the vowel with
okay.
her.
Oh,
I have never
um,
done that, so I'm excited to start a tip. I guess
okay.
for me, yes, clean up your speech sounds. As a teacher, a game changer for me is when I educated myself on the English language, when I learned the rules, when I learned the spelling generalizations. I I'm not a great speller. I was taught balanced literacy myself. So as soon as I started educating myself on the English language and morphology and etymology and everything, it was a game changer for me to then help my students and be able to target where they needed. Um,
Mhm,
if a teacher was to bring anything in their classroom, I guess I'm a first grade teacher, so more in the this range of age would be to start using sound boxes when you're working with words with students. That's when I truly saw my students start to grow. I have an example somewhere here. Um, sorry, do I? So, like, I just use something like this. So, when we're working on our words, where in the word you hear each sound, we talk about each sound, and then really learning that we're not, when we're spelling a word like that, it isn't THAT, that TH is making the sound in the
mhm,
word, and getting away from a word wall. Because if a student is looking for help to spell the word, I really like my digraphs today, I guess. If they're looking to spell a word like that, they're not going to know where to go on a word wall. So I'm doing things like that where I started using a sound wall, but that's a whole nother thing. But um, just attending to the sounds, attending to connecting the speech to print, and educating myself,
mhm,
educating yourself on the English language because you can't teach if you don't know.
mhm. Yeah. You had mentioned manipulating cards or tiles. I call
Hmm.
that tracking. And
Okay.
It's such an important activity. It is so helpful. Um, I would put out 10 letter cards with a couple of vowels, whatever I've taught, limit it to about 10, and say, pull down t. So the child would have to scan, look for the T, slide it down, run his finger under it and say t. And I'd say, change t to at. The child has to pull the A down and put it in front of the T. Run the finger underneath at. If that says at, change it to hat. Um, change hat to ham. Change. So you're only changing one
Mhm.
letter at a time. But you go like that, and you add. You can add if you've taught blends. You can change ham to cam. Change cam to clam. Um, change clam to clap, and so forth. So you just manipulate one letter at a time. That is so helpful. That's sort of like phonemic awareness, but um, with letters that you see. That ability to manipulate and move letters around,
Mhm.
the sounds around. So that's really useful, and you can do that. I guess every child can have a set of tiles. They can make their own tiles on sticky notes,
Mhm.
whatever is easiest. But that tracking, that activity is extremely helpful, especially when children are young and just learning. Um, the other thing, getting back to handwriting, because we never talk about handwriting, when we talk about reading, and we absolutely must, because it's so critical. How many students, get to the end of middle school and they can now read chapter books, but if you look at their written work, they look like they're desperate for an intervention. They can't spell, their handwriting is, sloppy. We can address that when they're 5 and 6 and 7 so that that doesn't happen. It's preventive. So teach letters when you're teaching handwriting, teach them as belonging to families and give students little mantras for how to write individual letters. So letters like T and B and D, and L and K would be top down letters. And you would teach them as a family, and then you would have them practice them as a family. Now, there are more approach strokes in printed letters than in cursive. Cursive only has 4 starting strokes, which is so lovely because 4 is, better than 11. But nevertheless, if you're teaching print, teach those, common starting point letters as groups. So your C and your, what else goes like that? Maybe your S, those would be in a family. So teach those. You wouldn't necessarily teach them in that order, but when you do teach a letter, have it mentioned that it belongs to this family so that there's some a mnemonic hook that the child can hang their hat on. Oh, this is the top down family, or this is the hook down family, whatever it is. Try to, and I have some of those resources if anybody's interested. Um, the other thing that we don't really talk about when we talk about all of this is oral language. Um, Whatever we can do as parents, as teachers, to help develop children's oral language, we want to do that because that morphs into their written language. And we care about written language as much as reading. So I love books without words. There are a whole group of fabulous books that don't have words. And I ask my students to tell me the story. And we work on phrasing, we work on speaking in complete sentences, we work on adding details, detail sentences, we work on summarizing what's happening on a page, but also describing details on the page in complete sentences. So that oral language is very important. Um, Read to children. Um, I mean, this is already being done, so that's not really a tip. I think my tips are mainly
Mhm.
for teachers themselves to know as much as they can about the language, specifically all the ways to spell the sounds. Um, Definitely the 6 types of syllables, There are about 9 or 10 major spelling rules that they need to teach students as they go up in the grades. Um, uh, the patterns for dividing long words into syllables, they need to know those. The other thing I'd like to recommend is that, um, we really think about teaching reading and spelling not just as a 3-year proposition, but possibly longer, but that there are sort of skills and abilities and awarenesses that students should have by the end of first grade, and to decide what those are, knowing that other things would be tackled in second grade. And you don't go beyond what you you want to ensure mastery by the end of first grade. So don't teach too much in one grade if the students can't achieve mastery. Break it up. Break it up over the years and make sure that the students have achieved mastery. And if they don't by third grade, we have to figure out how we can include reading instruction in class ongoing until all children can read, because it's just way too important. It is a crucial civil right to be able to read. It's a human right to be able to read.
Oh, Jacqueline, you're muted.
I was gonna say, Gina, it looked like you were gonna
Yeah.
add something.
No, I mean, it's absolutely true. I think watching it happen with my own kids and my students, that we were rushing to get them to be readers by second grade, and they're missing out on so much. I mean, I my other child, he spelled a word the other day. He's 13, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, okay, all right, we're gonna have
Mhm.
to sit down and go over things," because it's just through the years, I could tell by his spelling he didn't pick up on a lot of things. But you said something else that I loved what you said, and I thought about. Hopefully it'll come back to me. I should have wrote it down as you were speaking, but it had to do with I think just teachers. If I think about it, I'll let you know. Trying to
No
think of what it
problem.
was.
I wanted to invite everyone in the audience here to add questions. We definitely want to make sure we're answering your questions. And while you populate, I'm going to ask specifically about dyslexia. So, Lori, you spend a lot of your life working on dyslexia. Gina, you and I both have a child who has dyslexia and have done deep dives into it. Tell us about the dyslexic brain. What what is a dyslexic brain? How is that brain different from a typical brain?
Hmm. It well, I'm not a neurobiologist. Yeah, I
You know what?
can't.
Here, I'll tell you the way I describe it, and you tell me what you think about this description. So I often say it's, the neural pathways haven't all come together yet in a way that has happened in a typical brain. And in order to develop those neural pathways, you need a lot more practice and a lot more explicit instruction so that
Yeah.
over time they begin to build. The other way I try to describe it sometimes to a lay person is it's like you're born with one muscle being really strong in your arm and the other arm has a very weak muscle. It doesn't have an absent muscle, it has a
Yeah.
weak muscle. And so if you
Yeah.
think about building and lifting weights, the arm that has a very weak muscle has to have a lot more weightlifting to be activated and to build than the arm that is already with a very strong muscle. So maybe I should say react to
Yeah,
some of that.
yeah, yeah. It's it's been reported that about 5 to 12 and up to 20% of individuals, irrespective of where they live, who they are, what country they're in, have dyslexia. So it's a significant part of the population. Um, it's not as significant as the number of students who struggle to read. That's closer to 65% of the population that have some degree of difficulty. So dyslexia is only one of the reasons why children struggle. But the dyslexic brain, as far as I understand it, is that when researchers look at that brain under fMRI, they see more activity in the right hemisphere than they would see in an ordinary, reader, typical, normally developing reader, where more of the activity is in the left hemisphere. And then after an intervention, an effective intervention, there's more activity in the left hemisphere. and less in the right. So we know that the reading brain of the person with dyslexia is inefficient. It's inefficiently wired. Um, Now, I think those brains are specialized for other things, but that's for another conversation. And so, what happens is through good, effective reading instruction that includes handwriting and, you know, looking at letters and words and saying sounds and, very active. Just like physical therapy changes what's happening, so does academic therapy. So does, good reading instruction. It changes the brain, more activity in the left hemisphere. And what that means is greater efficiency. So, more rapid decoding, more accurate decoding, more automatic spelling, things like that. So, make it physical, make it repetitive, make it consistent. All of those things that we know work. Um, Dyslexia cannot be
There's a
cured.
question. Oh,
Oh, I was going to
go
say
ahead.
it cannot be cured. It cannot be cured, but I know from personal experience that students can overcome their challenges with reading and spelling and go on to live extraordinary lives. See it all the time. We just don't give up on those children. We make sure they get what they need.
There was a question here in the chat that asked about, are there differences in the techniques that work best for different types of dyslexia? Phonological versus rapid naming, orthographic, or is the approach the same for both? You want me to
So,
read that back? Are the Go ahead.
okay, go ahead. I was going to say, so phonological, rapid naming. Rapid naming is a processing capacity. It's kind of hardwired. I mean, we can do all, the way to address that is to do everything I've been talking about for the last hour. But it is a processing capacity, just like working memory, processing speed. We kind of get what we get when we're born. Um, you can certainly teach phonological awareness. You can do that with, teaching rhyming and letter sounds and patterns and things like that. Orthography and orthographics have to do with the spelling structure, the spelling system of the English language. And that requires um, pretty intense teacher training because I'll tell you, English has what's called a deep orthography. We have 26 letters, but we have all these sounds which can be spelled so many ways. And in order to be a good reader, you have to understand that the code is really three-dimensional. It's not one-dimensional, like in some languages, where, like in German, one letter has one sound and that's it. In English, that's not true. A sound can have, like the letter Y has four sounds associated with it. So you have to know that as a teacher to be able to teach it to others. So the, you know, um, the orthographic system is complex. Now, if kids have orthographic dyslexia, that means they have difficulty spelling. They might be a better decoder than a speller. How would I treat that? I would go back and I'd start from scratch and I would teach them how the letters represent sounds, how syllable type very often dictates what letter you're going to use to represent a sound. So if you think about the following words that have the letter Y, yes, G.
Gina, did we freeze?
I don't know. Well, we didn't
Lori
freeze
froze.
together, or
Okay,
maybe Lori
well,
froze, or maybe
she's
there she
freezing.
is. She's
So
back.
I
She's
will.
back.
We're almost at
Anyway,
time here.
we're out of time. Yeah, we're
So
out of time.
we're at time. I would love for you each to just give a very quick parting word. Any sort of one last, word, a sentence of advice or counsel or support.
Okay. I think, as teachers in the classroom, I think give yourself grace. Uh, Doing the smallest of changes will go a long way. Don't It's very overwhelming when you're starting your journey. I'm still in it. Um, it's it's a lot and you can't go in thinking, "Okay, tomorrow I'm going to do all this that I just heard about." Pick one thing, focus on it, and baby steps, and know
Mhm.
that we're all human, we're all learning. It's a big, big amount of information, from learning spelling rules and generalizations and the English structure of the English language, and also trying to fit in things in your day. And that's, Lori, what I was thinking about really quick. Um, Going back to thinking about vocabulary and oral language, even though we know as teachers, it's good to read to our kids, it's hard to fit it into the day with all we're required. So that is something I have really made sure that I have 10 minutes a day that I read to those kids and we talk about some of the words, and really not just reading the story to them, but making it a little bit more interactive. So
Mm.
if you can squeeze out even doing that and building their vocabulary in their own language, it's huge.
Right, right. You could
Mhm.
even have a morpheme of the week, like "ject,"
Yeah. Oh, I
and
like that.
as
Yeah.
they see it in their, handouts or
Hmm.
books or whatever, you can talk about it. Yeah, no, I would
Hmm.
say, it's easy to overwhelm people with all of this
Hmm.
because it's a lot. It's really a
Hmm.
lot. If it
It is.
were
It is.
easy, if teaching reading were easy, we would not be sitting here right now. We would not, all of us, we would not be here. It's complex, and there's an awful lot to know about
Mhm.
the language. But the good news is that the tide is turning. We're having these opportunities to learn an actually very old way of teaching reading that is
Yeah.
effective. This is great for the kiddos because they're going to learn, and the teachers are going to find new satisfaction with their jobs because they're going to be able to reach so many more kids.
Mhm.
I just want to thank you both, Lori and Gina, so much for being here.
Mm.
I'm glad they both said don't get overwhelmed, because there were moments where I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much to learn. I feel a moment of being overwhelmed. So I'm glad they said baby steps and try something and learn. And it's a process, it's a journey. So thank you all for joining us. We'll have another webinar next month. We'll send out a survey to get ongoing feedback, to make sure we're developing webinars that are useful to all of you that are on the front lines, and in districts and schools and parents that are trying to support their kids and keep on this journey together. So thank you very much to our two guests, and thanks to all
Thank
of you
you.
for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.